Hello there. Can't wait for YouTube to get itself sorted out, so we're just going to stream. Otherwise, it means waiting 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes for it to do whatever it's doing. So, where were we? Yesterday. So today what we're going to do is continue on with what we were doing yesterday, which is making our simple garage. And today what we're going to do is, well, we'll definitely sort out the materials. So we'll be adding some textures to our materials, because all we've done at the moment is we do have materials added. We did create them previously, but all we've done is added essentially a color to our material so we can distinguish what parts of the mesh, well, what material belongs to what part of the mesh. So what we have to do now is, for IMVU's sake at least, is apply some actual textures or something that we can export as a texture out for IMVU to use. What we may also then do is set up the basics of the room to work as a furniture room. So that means using all these components, all these cubes that we were talking about previously, all of those. Well, we don't need all of them, but so I'll be sorting those out and then turning this into an actual room that we can do a test export with. So let's double check the stream. It's sending data to YouTube, but it's not showing at all, which is mucho weirdo. Anyway, okay, well, so we'll leave that. YouTube be damned, as they say. Right, so we've already got a set of base textures, and they're just basically squares. Which are, where are they? Rooms. So this is all we need. Just different colored squares, so we can tell which part is associated with what texture. So we've got our materials assigned, as we were saying, just for the color. So what we want to do now is sort out, let's just hide these things. We don't need the helper dummies either at the moment, so we might be able to get rid of those, hide those, to make this easier to see. So what we're going to do is switch to shading workspace, and we'll still have access to material properties. We'll actually have access to all, well, not all the properties, but associated properties in the shading workspace. So if we click that, and we'll get this, and because each workspace has its own view settings, we have to re-establish this stuff again. So that should be 10,000. One. Close that. We're in textured mode, so we should be able to scroll out. There we are, and there's our room. So what we've got is our room that we've been working on. We'll add a garage door later, or we could just leave that blank. So we've got a preview in the top, This is our preview, and we've got the node editor at the bottom. And in Blender 2.8, if you've used Blender 2.79 or below, in 2.8 materials are now constructed from these nodes, these little blocks. And how they are connected together defines basically how the material works. So we can select and move and delete them and add to them, do all sorts of things with these. But for IMVU, we just need a basic material. And that is essentially just an image associated with this base set of nodes, which gives us these colors that allows us to put these colors on the mesh. And to do that, all we do is click the Add menu, and then from the Texture sub-menu, we add an Image Texture node. And what this will do is drop a node. So click to drop it into place, and that is our image node that's associated with the material. So what we want to do with this, in this case, we just want to open, so we click on the open button. Browse to our textures, select one. So we've got quite a few. Oh, they're all different versions of the same thing. So TGA, they can be TGA, JPEG, PNG, doesn't really matter whilst we're working in Blender. So select, open, that drops it in, and then we left click drag color node to the base color input. So color output, left click, drag that across, and it snaps to it, just release. And we can see a texture has appeared on those previously blue beams. So that is our framework material. So to do the same thing to the rest of the materials, what we want to be in is material properties, and that will give us all the materials that we've assigned already. So we had framework selected, so all we do is repeat the process. So we select wall panels, add texture, image texture, drop that into the desktop or the workspace, click open, browse to another image, select, open, drag that across, and that shows on all the areas that we had that material assigned to. Windows, same again, texture, image texture, browse. What did we have? So we've had the grace blue, open. Now that hasn't appeared on the, oh yes it has, Windows. There we go, the blue. So that's the Windows. Door. Link that up. And the material will always be black. If there's no image associated with the image node and you link the two together, it'll generally always be black. Open. So that's the door. And we've got the ceiling, but that's a separate element. So we have to select that. So the thing that's interesting about this is because we've still got, just going to wireframe to make this easy to see, because each section is still separated, we can select each in turn, and if they have unique materials assigned to them, we can then assign the material. But all the elements that are already assigned a particular material will update automatically to include or show that material. So we don't have to keep selecting components and sorting out the materials for each selection. If each section repeats or uses the same material, they'll assign to they'll appear on everything that uses that material. So we want the ceiling, so that is selected. Whoops, preview, add texture, image texture, it'll go black, open, that one's red, and then we need a couple more for the door frame, which it does have its own material. We did assign a material, or we could use the framework material that we already created. Now, if you wanted to do that, all you need to do is select the object that you want associated with that material, this framework material, and then the browse material to be linked button, so that's that one. Click it, and then we'll get a list, and then all we need to do is assign the framework material to that object, and it'll update automatically. And because these are separate, so the doors are all separate objects at the moment, and the window frame that we created, you would have to do the same thing for each one. But as we're going to have these as separate, what we want to do, whoops, is create, we need another, so I have to search for another couple of images that we can use. Should have plenty somewhere. So incidental music whilst we're looking for images. Could have sworn I had some. Okay, so it doesn't look as if I've got enough, so searching. Yep, so we don't have enough. So what we can do here, add texture image node, link that together. But for this, it's gone black. For this, we can click the new button, and we'll get this little new image pop up. So this section has popped up, and this allows us to create a generated image. So it's a temporary image essentially. So we want this to be frames. Let's make this 256 by 256. Select the generated type. UV grid or color grid is usually best, and then OK. And that creates a texture for us, and this is temporary. but it allows us to then do what we need to do next, which is the UV mapping section. So that should be all the textures that we need for our object. Oh, and the floor, so we've got the floor to do as well. So ground or concrete, click new. Ground, and we have to do the same thing again, add texture, image texture, new, ground 256 by 256, that's okay. Color grid, that's okay. Link the two together, and there is our temporary texture. So in texture preview, the textures that we assign override or replace the base color that we had previously. And I think the way that we would do this now, because we have textures assigned, is to use the viewport display color setting. But as it stands, we've got our materials assigned. So what we can do now, let's save this. We'll switch back to layout so we can see. So that's the room so far. So let's save this, save as 6. So what we have to do next is UV unwrap this. And for that, we need to be in a UV editing workspace. So switch to that, and we'll have to reset the view again. So scale 100, sidebar 10,000, 1. Switch to texture preview or material preview. So again, as yesterday, whoops, we've got rendered, material or texture preview, solid, wireframe, and then this button is X-ray, which is not available in all the previews. So we want textures so we can see, and then we can start unwrapping this. So which section have we got? When we switch to UV editing, it automatically switches the 3D view into edit mode on whatever was selected last. So if we've got a number of components, what we can do is just select all. So it's that end wall that was selected last. So UV mapping. Easiest way to do this is just by selection. So all we're going to do is in face select, all we're going to do is just select our individual faces or groups of faces. So we've got our selection made, and then from the UV menu we're just going to unwrap. And what that does is it creates, let's move that over there, that creates our UVs. And because this is a pretty regular or formally shaped object, this should result in a pretty regular or formal UV map that we can then manipulate and sort out for IMVU. Now for that, so we're in UV editing workspace. On the left we have the UV editor, on the right we have the 3D view. So in the editor for the UVs, we have a set of tools similar to what we have in the 3D view, but they do slightly different things in terms of what we're actually what we use them for. So we've got select, oh, not select, we've got move, rotate, and you can see that the widget changes with each one. So move, rotate, scale, and then we've got this transform, or universal as I like to call it, and that combines a number of the widgets into one tool, and that allows us to manipulate our selections just with the one tool instead of toggling between each of these three. So those correspond to move, rotate, scale, and we can see the widget similarly changes. And we've also got, whoops, our element selection type. So we've got vertices, edges, faces, and we've got a special one called islands, and this is the one that we'll probably use the most. So if we watch what happens to the UVs as we toggle through those, so we're in vertices at the moment, excuse me, so we can select individual vertexes and manipulate them. Edges allows us to select edges. Let's switch back to move so this makes it easier to see. So vertexes, and we get the widget following it. Edges, same again, widget follows what our selections are. And again, we can select multiples holding the shift key down. And it does the same sort of thing in the UV editor as it does in the 3D view. Faces, these are a bit tricky to select. There we go, where's the dot? It usually helps to click on the little dot that represents the face normal. So that's faces, and then islands selects the entire UV section as a separate unit. So we'll probably use this quite a bit. So transform. And now that we've got this, we can see the difference between the widgets. Particularly move and transform. With transform, we get this big, let's go into island, we get this big tool. So we can click on these corners, drag those diagonally, and it scales uniformly. We can click, drag an edge, any edge, and it'll scale in that specific direction. We can click on the X that's at the center, and that allows us to move it. And then if we click on the node that's sticking out, that will allow us to rotate it. And as with the 3D view, if we hold down the control key, it will snap whilst doing that. So no control, control. And it's the same with all of them. So no control, control. So what we're going to have to do to make this usable is organize the UVs. So we've got our selection, got our UVs, and generally speaking they're all going to be orientated the same way. So we can make a group selection and use the widget, hold control, rotate those 90 degrees. What we want to do is move them into the bottom corner. So we have we want to move the unit, so bottom left corner, is in the bottom left corner of the texture. And we want to use as much height space as we can, because what we can do with this is a simple texture assignment that's going to tile across our surfaces, and we'll see this in a second. Oh, one thing we can do with doing is UVs, snap to pixels, and then we want corner. And what this does is it means that the 256 by 256 image acts as a grid of sorts, and the vertexes, the UV vertices, snap to those pixel to that pixel grid. So snap, and then we scale that up. So we use the full height. Then we can grab these two and roughly align them based on where they are. So what we want to do is continue that texture across all three elements. So we're keeping it all relative. And it's the same. So essentially what we're doing is making sure that the textures are all aligned up properly, because what you don't want is for, let's say somebody paints a light switch down here, or either side, doesn't matter. If the UVs, if these sections were mapped like that, or over the top of this, or placed somewhere that was near these, those light switches would appear on these sections of the mesh, and we want to try and avoid those. So for buildings or projects like this, try and keep the UV alignment relative so that the texture flows across the surface. And we don't have to worry too much about stretching these. So what might be, what you might see done is stretching this to fill the hole, which will cause texture to distort. You want to try and avoid doing that, but it makes it slightly more tricky to derive from, because it means that the deriver has to be aware of the fact that it's not doing that, and texture their objects properly. So let's line this up to the edge. And this is where it starts to get repetitive. There isn't a quick way of doing this. So what we want to do next is the pillar, or the framework. Whoops, and it's best to do vertical sections first. So select UV and wrap. So that one, this one, is upside down, as we can see from the numbers. So we need to flip that. So we can either flip it or rotate it. If we rotate it, just grab the node and rotate. If we flip it, we have to go into the UV menu, mirror, and it's y-axis, I think, but that sometimes will reverse. It'll flip it the correct way up, but it won't be the right side. It it won't be flipped left to right correctly. So we then have to do that again on the x-axis. So what have we got for this section? So let's have a number. And again, align that. Then we can do the horizontal bits. Whoops. So the reason that we use a grid texture, so we need to rotate this. That way. So the reason that we use a grid when we're texturing, or initially texturing, is because what we want to do is make sure that the texture density is relatively uniform across the entire object. So if we look closely at this section, so this is the wall section that we did previously, and it's got a texture density that's determined by, well, it's not determined by, that's indicated by the way that the texture is gridded up into these cubes. So we can see that that cube is that wide on this wall section. On this beam it's much wider, it probably goes a bit further on. So what we want to do is change the texture density of this to match this. So we're going to scale that UV section. So that we get approximately the same. So the squares are roughly the same size. That is about that. Oh, maybe a bit smaller. Yeah, that's about right. So for one of the things that you want to watch out for, well, it's one of the things that you want to think about. So this section and this section running on the top, they are just wood panels. So as long as those, as we had them, as long as those are roughly aligned, we won't get any weird alignment issues, even though they are comprised of vertical and horizontal sections. So if that were plywood, that's what I was looking for, if that were a sheet of plywood, that would work because the grain of the plywood would be in the same direction regardless as to what section of the wall it's on. For our framework though, this creates an issue that we have to be mindful of, because if our texture has a wood grain that's aligned, so if we paint our texture with a wood grain that's aligned vertically, if we assign that to these beams as they currently are, what we'll end up with is a wood grain horizontally on one section, but then horizontally on another section and wrapping around the beam when we actually want it to travel along the beam. And the way that you do that is simply by rotating the UV. So we'll keep this section visible so we can see it. Select this section that we did earlier. Just make sure we've got everything selected. We can select that because we've got island mode active. And what we can do is rotate that. So which way around will it be? Doesn't really matter too much. Rotate it round to match the orientation of the horizontal beam. And what this means then is the wood grain of the image that we have will flow along the wood beam correctly. So we have to do that for each beam that's part of the room. We have to make sure that the UV sections are all orientated the same, well, not orientated in the same way, but they are orientated the same, so they occupy the same orientation relative to the texture that's assigned to the material. So that's one side done. Let's do the same thing. So those are orientated in different. Ooh, that's kind of weird. I wonder if, so let's double check something. Exit edit mode to object mode. View sidebar. And what is our object scaling? Yes, so because we must have scaled these, scaled the original mesh, what we end up with is wonky UV maps. So what we can do with these, we didn't do it with this one though, and that's why. So the scale values for that section we just did is all 1, 1, 1 on the X, Y, and Z. But for this new section, it's 0.5, 0.5, and 1. So object, apply, rotation and scale. That resets it. So we should find that that means we can unwrap this properly now. And yes, it does. So it's corrected the dimensions and proportions of the UV. So that's upside down. Or is it? No, that's the right way around. So another tip, depending on, well, when you unwrap multiple selections, Blender will do its best to keep them all proportionately or dimensionally related. So that means that we can adjust these two sections that we have. We can adjust these at the same time regardless as to where they are on the UV. So we've got this one section where we need it to be, which is down in the bottom left corner. So we can select the other one, adjust both of them to the right height using this window section as our guide, and because they are both proportionately the same size or relatively proportionately relative to each other, they'll scale in a way that we can use and they'll be the same size. So that's a quick tip. So let's go around and do the walls. Those are the easiest to do. Grab all the walls. Do we have to do it? Yes, we have to do a reset for that. So object, apply, rotation scale. Probably have to do it for all of them. No, we won't. Not that one. No, just a couple of them. So with this wall, we've got 3 sections. Blender has UV mapped them proportionately relative to each other within the texture space that we've got. We want to keep them all the same size relative to each other, but we can use this doorway as our guide. Keep them all connected as a group and just rescale it up. And that adjusts the UV map relative to the group. So all we need to do now is correct the orientation. And the alignment. It also doesn't matter. So ordinarily, you might have to plonk the UVs within the texture space that's available. You don't always have to do that because the game engine automatically tiles the texture across the UV map. And this just helps with the follow through of the texture across our sections. Alright, so the window is upside down. So beams next. These are all vertical, so where are our numbers? So that's okay. That's okay. That one's upside down. Because what you want to try and avoid is repetition. We're going to see tiling anyway, so if someone were to paint a bright patch on this texture, it's going to, well, this is for the wall, but we'll get that bright patch appearing twice across this wall. But if the UV maps were on top of one another, we might end up with that being a very obvious tiling issue, because the patch would appear at regular intervals across the entire surface of the mesh, and we want to try and avoid that. So same thing with the beams. We don't want the same wood section tiled on all the beams. So we could strip this texture down to, what is this, 256 by 64, paint a wood texture on this, and then tile that or use that on all the wood beams. But again, you end up with repetition. So what you want to try and avoid as best as possible is upsetting, well, not avoid, what you want to avoid is the tiling issue by upsetting the UVs. So placing them, so we've got these 3 beams for this section, on this section of the image. So with the next set of beams for the next wall section, we can place them in this section, the next ones in this section. So we can use a larger image that doesn't necessarily take up more file space when the product is being used, but it allows us a bit more variety and avoids the repetition of the texture. So we'll come back to the windows. We've done that one. We've done that back. Oh no, we haven't done the back wall. So let's do the back wall. Beams. Beams. So it's just those 2 center ones. So with these 2, what we can do, which way around is it? And this is why we have the letters as well as the grid, so we can easily see which way round something is. So that's upside down too. So we can shift these across to this section of the UV and avoid the repetition. Oh, and also what we want to do is double check our texture density. So again, we're using the grid. So we're using those units to define how tall these are. So we're matching the so they're that tall. So we've made those sections of the UVs a bit taller. Right, so next. So this has done something funny. So we're going to use, so which one is this? So that's the middle one. So we're going to use this bottom one as our relative scale. Scale them all the way up so that we get the same texture density again. What we can do with that one is put that there. That's this end one. Put that there. So this one starts the repetition again, but these 2 are using that bit of space that we hadn't previously used with the other sections that we've unwrapped. Right, ceiling next, and this could be tricky because we've got a lot of cross beams. So let's just do the ceiling first. Whoops, just noticed floor is not backface cold, so select it, backface cold. So what have we got here? We want to rotate these so they're all relatively in the same direction. Right, so for this, depending on what you wanted to do, we could leave this as smaller panels . Some of these are not like the others. Which way around is that one? So we have to do a bit of organizing here. So that's the middle. No, that's the bottom. That's the middle. That's the top. So why is that one larger? So those two are the same. Those two are paired. And those two are paired. So that's that. That's the middle. So let's just move those to the top. Let's see if we can fit those. No, we can't. Can't fit those. Because I don't think we can. Nope. So this is where it gets tricky, in the sense that so 1, 2, 3, we're missing 4, 5, so we've got 6, 7. So those two need to be switched. And those two. So what we can do with this as a group is just shrink that down so that it fits on our map. So we could do that. So what that would basically mean is that we would have, we could paint unique features that'd be relatively low resolution. With something like this, what we could do, so let me think about, yes, so we could leave the UV maps set out like this, because that would allow this ceiling section to be textured more uniquely. So you could paint light features on some of these segments and they would appear where you would expect them to. But the problem is we've got all of this wasted image because our image is square. So what we can do with this, go back into shading view, make sure we've got ceiling selected, delete that, so that was clicking the X, and create a new image, call this roof, and this should be width, height 512. So we're changing the dimensions of the image. Color grid, okay, and that gives us a color grid. So if we now go back into UV editing mode, it's smushed up the UVs because it's reassigned them to the new image based on the location and position of the UVs as was assigned to the previous image. So what we can do with these now is just edit them a little bit so that we have a bit more texture space. And if we really wanted to, because this is just a ceiling, double check that we've got pixel snapping on. Yeah. Just adjust our UVs a little. Align them so they touch edge to edge. So we maximize as much UV space as we can. Whoops. Techno it. Select all. And it's not going to distort the texture too much. So we can do that as an alternative. Otherwise, the other alternative is to map each of these segments to the same image and occupy as much space as possible. But that then means you have a very repetitive texture assignment. So again, if someone were to paint a lamp in the middle, you'd have a lamp or a feature or a bright spot on all of these sections, which you might not want to do. Right, so the beams. So it's best to do the ones that are in one orientation. And then select the others after we've done these. UV Unwrap. So has that separated them? No, it hasn't. Oh, it has on those end wall sections. Right, so these wall sections are separated, so we have to figure out. So that's that section, that's that section, but it looks like rotate. So those two are a pair. And these two are and again we want to align these UV sections to what will eventually be the wood texture. So we've got our grain top to bottom. Want to align these UV sections to that, and then what we're going to do is grab them and then again using the grid scale them so that we match the width. And it shouldn't require too much. Oops. So we've got to avoid, or got to be careful that, so this section looks like it's smaller than this, but we've got to remember that there's a gap in that UV which makes this square larger than the other ones. So we've got to watch out for that, make sure that we're using the right areas of the image. That's about right. And again, occupying as much of the UV as we can. And following the same orientation. So the ones in the opposite direction. Whoops. And this will create a lot of smaller segments. That we'll have to match up. So 1, 2. Flip that around. So that's that middle section. So it's often easiest with things like this to just unwrap, even though the texture or the UV will eventually be vertical. It's often easiest just to unwrap them and manage and edit them horizontally, just because it's easier to discern what's going on with the image. So as we're looking at the section of the mesh, we're looking at the placement of this UV section in relation to the image, and it just makes it easier to discern which way around things are. And then once we've done that, we can change the orientation of the UV into its final position. And again, we want to distribute the UVs across the space that we've got. And again, scale so there we go. So we can rotate that to align it to whatever our wood texture would be. In fact, let's push this over to the other side, because we've already done a couple of these that are on the left. So that's the beams done. Floor next, so exit, select our object. So again, because these are all separate objects, we're having to exit edit mode, back into object mode, select our object, and then toggle into edit mode. So that's the tab key, just makes it quicker. So we're selecting our objects. Unwrap. So we've got a similar issue with the floor. So what we can do, because we've already created a generated texture for this, what we can do is view sidebar, and it gives us the texture's properties that we created previously. And we can alter those here without going into shading. So that'll be 512 or 256. We could alter the width. And then rotate this. Whoops. Undo. Rotate that round. And do some quick editing. Whoops. So again, that allows us to create a relatively unique texture across the entire floor. It is a bit squashed, but it won't be too noticeable. So if we scaled it properly, it's probably going to be about that. So we don't lose too much of our texture space. So doors and windows. So we can do the same thing with these. well, what we could do with these actually is keep the 256 by 256 that we've got, but to avoid the repetition of the texture. So how many doors have we got? We've got 3 doors. Unwrap. We've got 1 door on this side. Let's make that take the full width. Select this door, unwrap. We can move this to the other side of the texture. Let that occupy that half. So we've got 1 texture being used on 2 doors. And then just repeat that for the 3rd. So that will use, whoops, that will use 1 and 2. Oh, it's upside down. That'll use 1 and 2. Oh, one thing that we have forgotten to do. We need to do a bit of editing to the mesh. So we need to detach this section so that it's part of the concrete floor. So select, where is it? Mesh, separate, selection. How far back did that go? Oh, just to the door. So we need to do it on all the wall sections where there's a door. Selection. And then join them to the floor. So select the 2, select, shift click, select, object, join. Oops. Join. That selected the, we don't want the wall, we just want that section. Why is it not letting me select it? There we go. Edit mode, because we want to access the UVs. So what we can do with this, select the floor, which gives us our UV, and pin this. So select the UVs, UV pin, and this will add a little red dot on the vertex which pins it and locks it into place. So that should then mean that if we select the rest of this, all, press the UV map thingamajiggery, we get our sections, which we'll have to rescale, but it doesn't alter our UV. And we also need to assign the correct material to that, so that's what is that? Wall panels, we want ground, assign, and it automatically updates. Ground, assign. Ground, assign. So we can also use our material buttons to select and deselect different elements of the mesh. And all we do now, so which one is that? So that's that one. Goes at the top. That's the bottom one. roughly place that. So that must be the side one. It is. So scale these. So they're about 2 units. So they're quite small. Double check our texture orientation. And then scale them to fit. Like so. Join that edge to edge. Do the same for the other 2. So that's the right way around. Where is it? And then the one at the top. So that one's the wrong way around. Oops. And this basically just avoids having to, if you get the UV maps lined up, it means that the texture will tile across there without any issues. Otherwise it would mean having to actually split the mesh and add extra structure, so we would end up having to maybe place or subdivide, split the mesh or subdivide it so that we add extra edge loops or extra mesh structure to accommodate these bits of, whoops, that's going to be wonky, these bits of mesh, so that we can then join the vertexes together so that we are unwrapping a unique well, not a unique, a single unique UV section that includes these little doorway elements. But if you get the alignment as best as possible sorted out, we don't have to do that because the image will just, it'll tile over it without there being any sort of noticeable issue, assuming you've got them rotated the right way around, of course. It'll tile across it as it is here. So this is the border of the texture, well, the border of the UV map, but we've got just a pixel or two over the edge, and it just easily just tiles over without any issue. So we can avoid subdividing and editing the mesh to add extra structure by doing that simple little thing. So that's the floor. So the door frames next, doors and windows. Oh, we've got to do the windows yet. So the windows, we can do the same thing that we did to the doors, to the windows. So select those. That's upside down. So that's on one half. And that is on the other half, and that's also upside down. And we'll do the window frames. Now these could be tricky. So as we said yesterday, depending on how you want the room to look in terms of, so as we look at the room now in the 3D view, that is how it will be viewed in IMVU. So we've got to decide how certain elements like these door frames and window frames, how they, well, not how they behave, what they represent in terms of, what we could do is, because we've extruded them all the way back, and we've kept the back faces in, they kind of obstruct the view based on their current design. So what we could do is just delete all of those. We don't need this back extrusion for the windowsill. Oh no, we do, because if we can see through the window, we want the windowsill to extrude slightly back a bit further. But what we can do is maybe, whoops, make the windows not quite as deep. Because they're quite thick based on how, let's just hide that one for a second. So how far back is the window? So do we really need the window this far back? Not really. So let's move it forward a bit and hide the frame. And do so. This is where it gets a little tricky, because we've got to decide how thick the window frames need to be. Switch into solid mode for the moment. That should be about right. Because we don't want the, because what we're trying to avoid is the back of the frames obstructing the view too much. But we want the illusion of the depth of the window as we're looking through it. So we don't want this back section butting up to the back of the wall that we've created, which is just here. So we'll do the same thing to the doorways, but now that we've done that, we can select, go back into UV editing, whoops, and we're all the way over there. So view, frame selected, jumps to what we were looking at. Do the two sides first. So that's one, that's two, then the top, and then the bottom. So this could be tricky because it's an awkward shape. It's basically a box. So what we may need to do here is actually do something a bit more advanced and add seams so that we can cut the UV and lay it out flat, because if we unwrap this now, what we'll end up with, so unwrap, is that. And we want this to lay out flat so that we can get the wood texture applied to it properly. So to do that we need to use seams. So switch to edge select. We need to, let's switch to wireframe. We need to select some edges. Mark those, edge, mark, seam, they'll highlight, and what this will do is wherever one of these appears, or wherever one of these is marked, it'll split the UV. So if we select this section again, there's quite a lot of, this mesh is a bit too complicated for what it is, so we may have to do something with this later. So now if we watch what this UV does, unwrap, and that's what it produces. So this is a bit complicated as a shape. But no, let's leave it. Let's leave it. So what we can do then is select all of that. So we want to select all the elements, and we need to just reorganize these. So what's that section? Oops. So that, where should that be? There we go, should be there. So we're checking to make sure that we've got the texture, checking the texture density, so change that one. So we've got our alignment, so each of the sections follows the wood grain that will be, or the paint, so they're all going in the right direction. So to save us some work, so we don't do that again, because that's quite complicated, we need to do it to the window that's on the opposite side of the room. But we don't want to do that again, so select, duplicate, and we can switch to, or move that over to the other side of the room, rotate, and drop it into place. So now we can hide that old one and use the frame that we've got. Oops, have to adjust the window. And then we'll need to do the same thing for the door frames, but I'll do that offline. Because it's quite, no, actually this is quite a simple structure relative to the window frame. So let's do one of these. Get rid of these back faces, we don't need those. Select the verticals, unwrap. So let's unwrap those two. That's upside down. And then select the horizontal, unwrap that. So the reason we're doing these in sections is if we don't, we end up with that. So if we select opposing components, essentially, we then have the UVs created in sections. That we can just easily manipulate. So we'll do the same thing to this. We don't want it sticking out quite that far back. And then duplicate, rotate. So we're holding Control down to snap to the grid. And then just move that into position to replace the old ones that we had there. So that's one, so we can hide that. Duplicate again. Move that into place, rotate, and then hide the old one. So that is our UV mapping done. Some of it is quite repetitive, it's quite fiddly. There isn't a quick way of doing it, not without, if you want to get the best from your mesh and how it's derivable, or how easy it is to derive, or how interesting the derivation will be, because like we were talking about earlier, you want to try and avoid obvious texture repetition. So like we were saying with the back wall, let's just hide the sidebar for the moment. We've got this set, whoops, what did I do there? Hidden the, oh, hidden it. So as we were saying earlier, what you want to avoid is, there's going to be texture repetition, but what you want to avoid is obvious repetition. So you don't want to necessarily just keep placing your UV sections on top of one another like that, because that then means that you have very obvious repetition. So again, if someone's painting a feature on the wall, so maybe there's a light or a switch or something, it then appears as an obviously tiled section across the wall. So you want to try and avoid that. So now, if someone were painting that same feature, it's now going to appear per UV map roughly like that, and then in very different positions on the mesh. But like I say, a lot of this it can be repetitious. There isn't a quick way of doing it, but it's always worth taking the time to get your UV map sorted out to try and avoid too much obvious repetition. And it allows you to make your rooms or your items much more interesting. What you can do is repeat, as we've done with the doors and the frames, because those are relatively incidental objects. Because they aren't next to one another, you won't notice too easily that the doors are all using the same texture, or that the window frames are using the same texture. But you would notice repetition for the back walls because you can see a continuous surface. So those little tricks, same with the doors as well. If you have a 256 by 256 or whatever size texture, we could have used a 512 by a 256 by 512, and that would have allowed. So if we imagine that is, so it's going to be about that big. So we've got door 1, door 2, door 3, and a bit of room for maybe door 4 if there were a 4th door on there. So how you use your textures will determine how interesting your room is. And it's still relatively simple, still relatively straightforward. You're not doing anything necessarily complicated, but in doing so, you are still keeping the room quite interesting from a textural point of view. But that is our UV map. So we didn't get time to do the room setup, which is probably good because that's a subject on its own. So in the next stream, we'll go over setting this room up as an actual room that we should then be able to export. So we'll set up all the nodes and things that we were looking at previously. But that is UV mapping. It's laborious, but it's worth taking your time over. Oh, let's save this. Save as. Should have done that earlier. Save as 7. Yep, so next, in the next stream, we'll set the room up for export. Right, so thanks for lurking, lurkers, and we will see you on the next stream. So that's an hour and 45 minutes. Time goes quickly. Right, so see you on the next stream. Bye for now.